Welcome back to the Make Math Happen podcast. So far in this series, we've looked at how to activate learning by sparking curiosity and connecting new ideas to students' prior understanding. We've also looked at how to accelerate learning by giving students early access to key concepts, experiences, and vocabulary so they're equipped to take on grade level content with confidence. Today, we're talking about what happens in the instruct phase of the lesson. Now, this is that critical moment when we either cultivate thinkers or create answer getters. To provide a little context, in my district, we have an instructional framework. That framework consists of the activate, that's the beginning of your lesson. That's like the first 5 to 10% of your class. You have your instruct, which is what we're talking about today, which is another big chunk of your class. And then we have the summary or the closure. That's where you're bringing all those big ideas together. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode. So this episode is all about what it means to slow down and let students wrestle. I want us to resist the urge to rush in with answers, okay? Because I know sometimes we feel like we need to be the savior when we see students struggling or we see students not doing the things that we want them to do. We feel like it is our job to rush in and provide them with the answers or provide them with the thinking. I want us to resist that urge, okay? This episode is also about how purposeful lesson study style planning makes it possible for us to create those thinkers. So the first thing that I want us to talk about in this episode is how planning can make space for thinking. So to provide a little context, I am in a program right now, and the class that I'm in is having us to either plan out number talks or think through a lesson planning protocol. So it's a lesson study type of activity. So prior to me facilitating a small group, I had completed this activity where I used this protocol to think deeply about this task and the things that I was going to do, the things that I wanted students to do. Okay. So I just want to provide you a little background so that you know that what I'm sharing with you in today's episode is about my experience leading this small group instruction. And I want you to think about how you can apply this to your classroom. Okay. So for this session, before my students ever walked into the room, I had already lived this lesson several times in my mind. So through that protocol, I had mapped out not just what I wanted my students to do, but what I wanted them to think about. That's one of the biggest benefits of planning through that lesson study lens is it forces you to slow down to ask what sense making looks like, what student thinking might sound like, and how will I respond when it does not go as planned? Oftentimes, when we're lesson planning, we're kind of skimming things. We're like, okay, I know how to do this concept, so I should know how to teach this concept. And one thing that I really want to urge you to consider is knowing how to do something for yourself does not mean that you know how to teach someone else to do it or teach someone else to understand it. So I want us to think about that when we are planning and really force ourselves to think about how can I make students think through this? How can I make them reason? How can I make them make sense of the situation that's being presented? So my goal for this particular session wasn't just to get through the task. My goal was to get students through their own thinking. I wanted them actively engaged in that task. I wanted to shift myself from being an answer giver to a question answer. And this is actually one thing that I know is a strength of mine. I can ask a good question. Okay, so when my students came in, they found the building a pizza task already on their desk. I had it set up and ready to go. I told them to read it silently first. That was going to be our first read. Then I asked them, what is this situation about? One of the students said, the cost of toppings. Another student said, buying pizza from Domino's. Now, sometimes we want to focus on efficiency and we want to get right to the answer. So sometimes if a student says something wrong, we may correct them, or if a student says something right, we want to go ahead and quickly affirm them. But sometimes we have to pause and give students an opportunity to reason with what has been shared out, to make sense of what their peers have shared out. If I want students to make sense of problems and persevere, okay, that's a standard for mathematical practice. That's number one. I can't do the sense making for them. So what I did was after students shared their responses, I asked them, show me evidence that supports whether this situation is about the cost for toppings or buying pizza from Domino's. Okay. So then they were able to point me directly to that first statement in the task. The first statement. That one question slowed them down. That started reasoning instead of reacting. And it's also having them to practice some of the skills they're going to need in those ELA classes, in those social studies classes, as well as science, right? So we're kind of building their capacity, and it's going to impact them no matter where they are. So I want to use questions to advance my students' thinking because I knew that this group of students struggled to organize information. This is something that we have been talking about in data dives with all of the students in our school, really. I had them to create a table. Now, I'm sharing that because during my lesson study, I came up with several different representations that students could use to reason about the relationship between the quantities in this pizza task. But again, because I knew that this group of students had issues organizing information, I said, we're going to keep it simple. All right. So I said, I want you to create a table. When they labeled their columns, some of them put just toppings and cost. So what I did is I pressed them. I said, what you mean by toppings and what kind of cost are we talking about? I wanted them to refine their responses. I wanted them to refine their labels. I wanted them to be specific. Okay. So eventually they did end up sharing with me that we're talking about the number of toppings and we're talking about the total cost of the pizza. That clarity came from questioning, not correcting. It wasn't me just giving them the answer and saying, no, let's change this to this. No, I need you to think about what is it that we're talking about? Every question that I asked my students was intentional. In fact, the questions were written in my lesson study plan under the assessing and advancing sections. So assessing questions is where you're asking them questions to understand whether or not they understand. And advancing questions are exactly what it sounds like. Like, I'm going to take you a step further here. Okay. So that's how you build the construct viable arguments and critique reasoning of other skills within our students. You don't get there by giving them answers. You get there by engineering the moments of productive struggle. I need for them to be able to explain why it is what it is. I need them to think about what their peers are sharing and ask themselves, does this make sense? At one point, one of my students decided that the cost per topping was $7. Okay, how did he come up with that? So in the task statement, it told us that 2-topping pizza costs $14 and a 5-topping pizza costs $20. So obviously he was just looking at that first row, knew that I could multiply 2 times 7 to get 14. He was like, bada boom, bada bam. So when that first question asked him, what is the price for a topping? He said, it's $7. Some of us may want to rush in and say, no, that's not right. But I am challenging you to, instead of quickly correcting, ask them a question. So if the cost per topping was $7, would the second row of our table make sense? Would 5 toppings costing $20, the pizza costing $20, does that make sense if toppings are $7 a piece? And that's when it started to click for them. They started testing ideas and not waiting for my ideas, okay? I do want to get these particular students to the point where they are collaborating with one another more. I had to really push them to talk to each other. But what I did see in that lesson is them thinking through their own understanding, them looking at their own representations and making sense of that. Okay, so baby steps, right? So again, what I wanted them to be able to do by looking at that table and making sense of whether or not $7 was the correct answer, I wanted them to reason abstractly and quantitatively. And it happened because I practiced effective teaching practice number 4, and that was pose purposeful questions. I know many of us have those posters up in our room, or at least we used to, where we have the standards for mathematical practices and we have the effective teaching practices. But how often are we being intentional about the use of them? Okay. So I'm challenging you to go pull those up, go into your room and look at them and think about, how much of this am I doing in my classroom every day? Purposeful questions are like scaffolds. They don't build the structure for students. They show them where to place their next beam of understanding. So when the students were getting stuck finding the cost of one topping, I pivoted. Okay. I didn't reteach anything, but I did it to reframe their thinking and to make sure that it was grounded in prior knowledge. So we compared proportional and non-proportional graphs. I drew a graph on the board. One of them was proportional, one was not. I didn't tell them that. I had them to recall some previous experiences. These were 8th graders. I wanted them to recall some work that they had done in 7th grade, as well as some review that they did at the beginning of this year. So I drew those graphs on the board for them. They talked about what was proportional and what was not, right? Then they noticed the y-intercept. And then they remembered that it represents the initial value. They identified the slope and they remembered that it represented the rate of change. And then I was pushing them. I said, okay, so tell me, if we know that we're looking at y-intercept to determine what's our initial value here? We're looking at slope to determine how does one quantity change in relation to the other. How can we then apply this to this situation? Like I was pushing them. I was pushing it. Through questions, we connected the table, the graph, and the equation, building towards them looking for and making use of structure. That's another standards for mathematical practice. Okay. So by the end, and this was a challenge. I don't want you to feel like this was something that happened quickly or happened easily, but it did happen efficiently because I had those students thinking about and making sense of the fact that the titles of our table were the number of toppings and the total cost of the pizza. So in order for us to generalize the relationship and be able to determine any cost of a medium-sized pizza with any number of toppings on it, I had to really push them to think about what did total cost consist of. And so through several levels of questioning, we ended up concluding that the total cost of pizza consisted of the number of toppings and the cost per topping. And then we had to wrestle with what's the relationship between the number of toppings and the cost per topping. And eventually we came to the point of multiplication because the student said it's like repeated addition. And then they concluded that it also consisted of the price of the pizza without any toppings. So we got there, y'all. We got there. But it took me writing it out in words first, then connecting those words to symbols. I had to keep pushing them back to that table, keep helping them to make sense. And then once we were able to generalize it, I asked them, let's try it out. Okay. So let's look at this and see if this rule works. That moment wasn't about me teaching them a formula. It was about them constructing it. I wanted them to understand, how do I relate things to one another? What am I looking for to relate things to one another? What makes sense when I'm talking about relationships between two or more quantities? And I did that through thoughtful questions. So here's what this experience reminded me. We talk a lot about student inquiry, but teacher inquiry matters just as much. When I plan through this protocol or I lead a lesson study with teachers, what I'm really asking is, how do we plan lessons that teach us about our students? So when you're thinking about anticipated responses from your kids, you're thinking about your students. When you're thinking about, how do I launch this lesson in a way that activates prior knowledge, you're thinking about your students. You're thinking about their experiences. When you think about your pre-teaching or your acceleration, you're thinking about your students because you're thinking about which of your students, could be all of them, could benefit from the exploration of specific topics so that they're ready when you get to that lesson that you know is going to be a heavy lift. You're thinking about your students, okay? You're teaching yourself about your students. So because effective teaching practices, things like eliciting evidence of student thinking, supporting productive struggle, and connecting representations all start with one thing: intentional, anticipatory planning. Without that preparation, that questioning becomes reactive. But with the preparation, questioning becomes responsive. And responsive teaching is where the learning lives, right? You need to be prepared to respond and not reacting in the moment. And I've seen that happen all too often, where in the moment we haven't fully prepared for something and we're trying to come up with things off the cuff. And sometimes the things we come up with don't make sense. It makes sense to you when you say it, but it don't make sense to the people that hear it. Okay, so purposeful planning kind of positions you to not have to do that. Okay, now obviously you're not gonna be able to think of every single thing, but if you got a toolbox of things, then you are definitely ready to go. Okay, the truth is our students are capable of deep reasoning, but only if we give them the space to think. Because yesterday's session could have gone really differently if I was rushing to give them answers versus pushing them to come up with them on their own, right? Rushing to give them answers instead of pushing them to think about, what is this task about? And we spent that whole time together on one task, just one. And I had to remind them that learning isn't about your teachers give you the answer, you waiting for your teachers to tell you things. It's about you thinking. It's about you making sense of things. It's about you looking for and making use of structure. It's about all the things that are in those standards for mathematical practice. And we have to help our students understand that. Okay? No more taking the easy way out. We got to help them understand why we're up there in the first place, why we are working so hard in preparing them these lessons, because we're trying to build skills within them that will help them be successful even after they leave our classrooms. So that means we have to stop equating speed with understanding. We have to normalize silence, confusion, and curiosity. Okay? Confusion is okay because now that's an indication to me that something doesn't make sense. And I'm gonna figure out what it is. And I'm gonna try to meet you there. Okay. And curiosity. I need students asking questions. I need them thinking about their thinking, metacognition. Okay. The goal isn't to fill their pages with right answers. The goal is to fill their minds with good questions. When we align our instruction to the standards for mathematical practice and ground it in the effective teaching practices, we're not just teaching math. We're building thinkers who can reason, justify, and make sense of the world. So as you plan your next lesson, I want you to ask yourself, what questions will invite my students to think? Where can I step back so they can step forward? Because every great math lesson isn't defined by what the teacher said. It's defined by what the students began to see. So keep planning with purpose, keep teaching with intention, and as always, keep making math happen.